Welcome to everyone logging on and joining us. We're gonna wait a couple of minutes to let people get connected, but please feel free to write your name in the chat and where you're from, what organization or faith community you're with, if any. We're very happy to have you here. Susan, did you have a slide that you wanted to share? Because I'm seeing a request from you.
No, sorry, I wanted to chat. So that's a mistake.
Oh,
Sorry
okay,
about
sorry.
that.
So thank you to everyone who's been putting their introductions in the chat. Very great to have you all here. I think I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and I know we want to try to keep this to an hour. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started with the introductions. So my name is Geneva Blackmer. I am the interim director for the Interfaith Center at Miami University. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to unify people through relationship building, dialogue, and social action. And I'm very pleased to be welcoming our speaker, who is with our partner organization, the National LGBTQ Task Force. Mira, who uses she, her pronouns, is a state policy analyst at the National LGBTQ Task Force. She received her JD from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law with a certificate in health law and pro bono service, and her bachelor's in science in psychology from the University of Pittsburgh as well. She has dedicated her career so far to advancing policy priorities on both the federal and state level, with a focus on reproductive justice, LGBTQ rights, immigration, healthcare, and more. She identifies as South Asian and a daughter of Indian immigrants. The issue of marriage equality is near and dear to her, and she's honored to discuss this issue with all of you today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Mira.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Geneva, you can go to the next slide. So thank you so much for everyone joining us today for this important conversation on the history, current landscape, and the role faith plays in marriage equality in the United States. I wanted to share the agenda for today. So we're going to start with grounding in the history of marriage equality, including restrictions on same-sex marriage, the movement to enshrine marriage equality into state laws, pivotal Supreme Court cases, and federal laws that address marriage equality. Then we're going to talk about the current state of play or the current landscape, including the most up-to-date laws, which states have enshrined marriage equality in their constitution or by state statute, which states are in the process of trying to do that, and what states are moving to enact anti-marriage equality laws. We're also going to discuss the many states that still have bans on marriage equality in their state law and or constitution, even though they're not active We're then going to discuss other threats and challenges to marriage equality, including what would happen if the Supreme Court overturned the federal right to marriage, trigger laws on the state level, and then the faith movement that has been both mobilizing to protect or, on the other side, attack marriage equality using concepts such as religious freedom that we're all familiar with. And then before we get to the faith aspect, I'm going to turn it back over to Geneva, who is going to moderate a discussion with one of our couples. And then we will have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions and wrap up. And if we don't take everyone's questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll try to get you a response after the webinar. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to start with a disclaimer before we start the conversation. So for purposes of this presentation, I'm going to refer to the term same-sex marriage to encompass all types of marriage for two adults that include LGBTQ plus people outside the framework of one cisgender man and one cisgender woman. So you're going to hear me talk about, especially in the history part, where it's marriage between one man and one woman. So when I say same-sex marriage, it's going to be all the marriages except that. Please, next slide. So let's dive into the history of marriage equality. So I have a timeline here that I'm going to walk through each component of. So we're going to talk about the Defense for Marriage Act, which was signed into law in 1996. We're going to talk about Massachusetts. We're going to talk about California and Proposition 8, which was one of their state laws. The U.S. Windsor case decided in 2013. And of course, everybody knows the Obergefell case decided in 2015. I'm going to also talk about the Respect for Marriage Act and what it does on the federal level, and also what its limitations are in the context of marriage equality. Next slide, please. So before we dive into each of those, I wanted to show this map that Washington Post put together that shows where same-sex marriage is legal and not legal before the Obergefell ruling that made same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. So as you can see, a lot of states leading up to 2015 had already made same-sex marriage legal either by state statute or by or in their constitution. And then there are states, obviously, that it was not legal. And I want you all to pay attention to states like Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, because we're going to get back to them later and talk about their efforts to attack marriage equality on the state level, despite it being legal because of the Obergefell ruling. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a little bit of framing. So efforts to legalize same-sex marriage began to ramp up in the 1990s, especially in the late 1990s. In 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Defense Against Marriage Act, which is also known as DOMA. And that defined marriage as a union between one man and one woman. So this essentially means that at the time, states could refuse to recognize same-sex marriages performed in other states. And notably, it also excluded same-sex couples from receiving benefits associated with marriage. So that includes Social Security benefits, federal tax benefits, such as joint tax filing, and tax-free employer health benefits, military benefits, and the list goes on. And these were all excluded, even if marriage was legally recognized in their home state under the law. And when Bill Clinton was asked later why he signed DOMA, he said, quote, "It was a very different time in the 90s." But in an op-ed in 2013, he stated that DOMA was incompatible with their constitution and equal protection under the law. So he had admitted that years later that it had been a mistake to sign DOMA into law. And other things to note in the late 90s are that in 1997, Hawaii became the first state to offer domestic partnership benefits to same-sex couples. In 1998, Alaskan and Hawaiian voters approved state constitutional bans on same-sex marriage. In 2000, the Central Conference of American Rabbis agreed to allow religious ceremonies for same-sex couples, while in Vermont, it became the first state to pass a law granting full benefits of marriage to same-sex couples. In that same year, Nebraska voters approved a state constitutional ban on same-sex marriage. So from 1996 to about 2010 to 2015, we're going to see a lot of states taking individual action, either putting same-sex bans in place or protecting same-sex marriage and benefits. And so that brings me from 2000 to 2003. So the Supreme Court decided that in Lawrence v. Texas, that a Texas law that criminalized same-sex sexual activity violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of liberty. So essentially, the case established that adults have a right to private sexual intimacy, regardless of sexual orientation. And they overturned a very contentious case, which had upheld a Georgia sodomy law, which was called Bowers v. Hardwick. And in that same year, in 2003, California passed a domestic partnership law, which provided same-sex partners with almost all the rights and responsibilities as spouses in civil marriages. And this was also the same time when President Bush was in the White House, and he had stated publicly that he had wanted marriage to reflect only one man and one woman in the public eye. And around the same time, Massachusetts made it the first state to legalize gay marriage in 2004 in a court ruling called Goodrich v. Department of Public Health. So that was a massive win, and that was by the Massachusetts Supreme Court. So it wasn't a voter ballot measure. It wasn't a constitutional amendment. It was a Supreme Court ruling. And then in 2004, San Francisco started marrying same-sex couples, as many of you probably know, despite them having a state ban. In the same year, the California Supreme Court voided same-sex marriage. And then 4 years later, in 2008, they approved a constitutional ban to same-sex marriage known as Proposition 8. And so California is going back and forth. And around the same time, New Jersey legalized same-sex marriage through their state Supreme Court. So we are seeing states really take on this issue of marriage equality because we don't have any really protections on the federal level at this point. And we only have DOMA, which is a restriction of recognizing same-sex marriages from state to state. And so lastly, in 2010, the US Supreme Court in Hollingsworth v. Perry overturned Proposition 8. So the reasoning for this is because, and this might get a little, I don't want to get too legalese with it, but the proponents of the measure, so the people who supported Proposition 8, who supported the constitutional ban to same-sex marriage, lacked standing, which essentially means, it's a fancy way of saying they didn't really have a case to bring to the Supreme Court. They themselves were not injured by the ban. So the court dismissed it and said, well, you actually can't bring this case to the Supreme Court because you didn't actually suffer an injury. And notably, the court didn't really answer whether this was an equal protection issue. So, and we're going to see later in Obergefell that the Equal Protection Clause plays a role. But here they didn't take the time or didn't want to answer the question of whether the EPC prohibits California from defining marriage as one man and one woman. So we see this today too, where courts may, especially the Supreme Court, may dismiss a case because of a lack of standing. But that means that they don't actually answer the legal question at hand, that they don't actually make a decision for something like this. So next slide. All right, I'm almost done cases. Bear with me. So US v. Windsor was decided in 2023. So we just talked about DOMA that established that in federal law, marriage refers to one man and one woman. And in that same time, we saw many states trying to legalize same-sex marriage. And what Windsor did is it invalidated Section 3, which is what defined marriage as one man and one woman. So because DOMA denied same-sex couples the right to marry available to other opposite-sex couples and treated them differently to not be able to access marriage, it violated the Fifth Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And so a lot of people talk about Obergefell, which I'm going to in a second, but US v. Windsor really started to pave the way for marriage equality across the United States. And then so that leads us to Obergefell in 2015. So this case was very narrowly decided. It was a 5-4 vote. But essentially what it did was it legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. And just a little background of the case, Obergefell sued in court saying that he was unable to put his name on his late husband's death certificate, along with other plaintiffs from Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, and Tennessee, a lot of southern states who could not marry their same-sex partners. And so essentially Obergefell said the right to marry is a fundamental right under the 14th Amendment, and to not be able to get married as a same-sex couple violates the Equal Protection Clause. And notably here, the majority opinion refused to leave this issue up to the states, which is what we're going to talk about when we talk about the current landscape. They thought that a fundamental right like this should not be left up to popular vote. It should not be left up to the states. It should be something that is a fundamental right to everyone. So dissenters, Justices Robert, Scalia, and Thomas, believe that this should have been left up to the states. And we're going to see this parallel that right now, after the Dobbs decision, which overturned the constitutional right to abortion in 2022, that is when the fundamental right to abortion got sent to the states. And so when we talk about the threat of Obergefell falling, we're going to talk about how it may possibly be that it will be an issue left up to the states. And then lastly, the Respect for Marriage Act is from 2022 is when President Biden signed it into law. It mandated federal recognition of same-sex marriages. So that means stronger protection for same-sex marriages, like enforcing Obergefell in that way, and requiring states to recognize same-sex marriages performed in other states. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't put Obergefell's ruling that same-sex marriage is legal in all 50 states into the law. So that's what I just mentioned. If Obergefell were to be overturned, states would then become the deciders to whether same-sex marriage would be legal in their state. All the Respect for Marriage Act does is that if you got, you and your same-sex partner got married in a state, then it would have to be recognized in another state. So that's what the Respect for Marriage Act does. That is the limitation of it. And so that's going to bring me to my next section of the current landscape of states. Oh, but before that, I forgot. So I wanted to take this quote from Obergefell, just take a second and skim through it. I just thought that it was really a powerful quote, and why they really advocated for the argument that this is an equal protection issue. And the last sentence that says, they ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right. So this issue, abortion, contraception, which was under the right to privacy, the court was trying to establish that like people should not be treated differently to get access to a fundamental right. So I think that this quote is very powerful. The opinion is very powerful, but I wanted to just showcase this and really show the tide turning with the Obergefell case. Okay, next slide. All right, so this brings me to the current landscape of marriage post-2015, post-Obergefell. So we know now that same-sex marriage is legal in all 50 states, but let's talk about what's going on in the state level. So currently there are 26 states which have constitutions including bans on same-sex marriage or other types of unions, and 30 states still have statutes that ban same-sex marriage or other types of unions, even though all of these technically are not they're defunct under Obergefell. They're not put into law, but they're dormant. They still exist in the law. And some good news is that Nevada became the first US state with 62% of their voters enshrining or putting into law the right to same-sex marriage in the Nevada Constitution in 2020. And that was really historical because to change a state constitution, you have to have the state legislative body pass a law through both the Senate and the House. And that has to end up on a ballot measure. So during the next election, voters can decide whether or not they want to put that in law. So to be able to have gotten that majority of voters in the state of Nevada, 62%, to put that in the Constitution was a big deal. And it kind of illustrated that, especially around this time, post 2015, a lot of Americans really supported same-sex marriage, and people were showing up in their states and voting just for that. And then along with Nevada, California, Hawaii, and Colorado changed their state constitutions in 2024 to enshrine same-sex marriage. So all 4 of these, including Nevada, have same-sex marriage legal in their state statute. So that means even if Obergefell were to be overturned, same-sex marriage would still be legal and still be protected in these states because they have these laws on the books and they're active. And also as a side note, how this works is federal law trumps both state law and state constitutions. And so that's why we see the ruling of Obergefell be the law of the land and not these state statutes and constitutions that conflict with the uplifting the ban on same-sex marriage. And then there are states who have marriage equality in their state statute. So in 2013, Washington, Maine, and Maryland legalized same-sex marriage by popular vote. And then a lot of other Northeast and Midwest states like Rhode Island, Delaware, Minnesota, New Jersey, Hawaii, Illinois, and even New Mexico all put them in their state statute. And Iowa is a great example. So Iowa's state statute, it's banned, but same-sex marriage is protected by court order. So you'll see, like, either by the Supreme Court or state statute or in the state constitution, same-sex marriage could either be banned or protected. Next slide. So which states are working to put marriage equality into their laws? So a few states have in their legislators introduced legislation that would enshrine marriage equality in their states. So for example, Idaho this past session introduced something called Joint Resolution 2. All you need to know is that it's a piece of legislation, and it proposes an amendment to the state constitution to lift the ban on same-sex marriage. Now, that has not moved in legislation. It is just kind of sitting there. And as you'll see with the other states I'm about to talk about, all of them are kind of sitting there or didn't pass. And so I'm going to explain like these kind of pieces of legislation. They may not necessarily move depending on who makes up the legislator, who's the majority. And then even then, if it ends up on the ballot, if your voters are going to show up and pass with over usually a 50% threshold. So Nebraska had 2 constitutional amendments, but to lift the ban, but that has not moved either. Virginia has House Joint Resolution 9 and Senate Joint Resolution 240. You don't need to know the numbers. You just need to know that it would repeal the ban in the state constitutions as well. Arizona has one, has not moved. And then one that I didn't put here in the slide was House Joint Resolution F in Michigan, which would remove the one man, one woman union language in the state constitution. So they're all very similar. They're all just trying to ensure that there are no bans and there's protections for same-sex marriage on the state level if, God forbid, something happened on the federal level. And no, if these resolutions pass through the legislature, which some of them probably won't, they may end up on the 2026 state ballots and then voters will vote for them. So that's sort of the process. And another one that I wanted to also bring up is Montana. Rep. Zoe Zephyr, who is a very staunch advocate for LGBTQ rights. She's great. She tried to formally legalize gay marriage in Montana as well. She spoke on it in the legislature. She really tried to push it through. But unfortunately, Republicans stopped the bill from moving. So as you can see, there are roadblocks and a lot of steps that need to happen before something like this can end up in the law. But we've seen the successes of states that protect it and that it is possible. It just depends state by state. So, and then next slide. So I wanted to pivot a little bit to threats and challenges. I've kind of already previewed it a little bit as I was talking about the current landscape. But the next slide, which you don't need to go to right now, it's going to show a map of states of trigger laws, but I'm going to explain that right now before we get to the map. So trigger laws are essentially state laws that would immediately take effect or ban or restrict same-sex marriage if Obergefell is overturned. So making this decision fall to the states has its own threats because a majority of states still have in place both bans in their state law and or state constitutions. And I previewed this, but this is exactly what we saw when Roe v. Wade fell and the constitutional right to abortion was overturned. States immediately moved to enact abortion bans. And I think right after the decision, it was like 13 states had moved immediately to put a type of abortion ban in place, whether it was a full abortion ban, a partial abortion ban. And we saw that happen immediately. So it's like reading the tea leaves that this case is very similar to or the potential is similar to Dobbs. And so that is the threat that we will see when it's left up to the states. And then other threats, I would be amiss to not talk about the current administration we're in. I don't know if everybody on this call knows Project 2025, but it was or is a blueprint that has been associated with the Trump administration. And it's a 900-page blueprint with a ton of plans that were to be put forth during this administration. And even though it doesn't explicitly say that it plans to overturn Obergefell or put restrictions in place on the federal level, it does advocate for the government to actively promote heterosexual marriage and parenthood, viewing a married mother, father, and their children as the ideal family structure. And we've seen in this current administration, time and time again, anti-LGBTQ sentiments either put forth on an executive order, put forth in lawsuits on the federal and state level. So we know that that in itself is a threat outside of just marriage equality, but because it is encompassing all of the other LGBTQ rights, it's a threat that we have to name, even if it's not actively in Project 2025. And then the Supreme Court justices. So Justice Clarence Thomas, in the Dobbs opinion, indicated that the rationale the court used to overturn the right to abortion should be used to overturn cases that establish rights to same-sex marriage, same-sex relationships, sexual same-sex relationships, and contraception. And so the consensus is kind of all over the board, but many partners think that the threat of the decision overturning is minimal right now. But I think some are still worried about seeing something like Dobbs repeat itself. So I know it might be a question I get, like, what is the likelihood? I really can't answer that. I think every person has a different analysis and a different way of viewing it. And I think people really didn't see Dobbs coming, and some people did. So I think that's kind of the way to view it. And that's why we are trying to see this movement on the state level to make sure that these protections are in place. Next slide. So this is talking about the trigger laws. So these are states where gay marriage, same-sex marriage would become illegal if Obergefell were overturned. And if you remember the map that I had showed you in the beginning of states where it was same-sex marriage was illegal before Obergefell, there is a lot of overlap here because they have those laws on their states, on their state laws and in their state constitutions. So North Dakota, South Dakota, Texas, Kansas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and the list goes on. You can see a lot of southern states and a lot of Midwest states, which also kind of maps out the way abortion looks as well. Next slide. So before I turn it over to Geneva, I have just this one more slide that I wanted to go through. So we're seeing efforts to introduce and pass legislation on the state level to overturn Obergefell. We're seeing it in Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. This type of legislation is symbolic. So the legislative body can't actually overturn a Supreme Court decision. That's not possible. And in these pieces of legislation, they don't actually address the state law around marriage equality. They're not saying change this or change that in their state law. All they're saying is that Obergefell was wrongfully decided, and that's about it. So none of these have passed in any of these states. It doesn't carry the force of the law. It's just asking the Supreme Court to essentially revisit the decision. So I think that's really important to know, because people might look at this and see, oh my God, they're trying to put it into law, but really what they're doing is they're just messaging. They're kind of showing like, here, like this is what we as a state think should happen on this on the Supreme Court level. And then lastly, covenant marriage legislation has popped up in states like Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, and Tennessee. And they don't explicitly refer to Obergefell, but they want to create a separate category called covenant marriage, which is essentially one man and one woman. So they're not addressing Obergefell. They're not, they're not putting that explicit out there, but they're creating a new category to ban same-sex marriage. Okay, I'm done for right now. I'm going to pass it to Geneva. And then I just have a very small section about faith afterwards.
Great. Thank you so much, Mira. Okay, so now we are going to move into testimonial. And Susan, I believe you have Barb with you now. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So Barb has been out as a lesbian since 1973. She earned a PhD in 1977. She's a professor emerita of English and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Earlham College, and currently on the boards of Oxford Citizens for Peace and Justice and the Moon Co-op in Oxford, Ohio. Susan has also been an out lesbian since 1976. She has been a practicing clinical social worker for 38 years, and she has been on the Oxford Citizens for Peace and Justice board for many years here in Oxford, Ohio as well. So thank you both so much for being here with us and being willing to share your story. So I have a couple of questions, and I'm just gonna jump into the first one, unless either of you have anything you wanna say first. No? Okay. So the first question, have you faced any discrimination or challenges in accessing services or resources, even after the legal recognition of marriage equality, including but not limited to decisions about family planning, adoption or fostering, or joint property ownership or estate planning?
Incident. No, I'd say probably not.
Can you hear us all right?
We
Okay,
can.
good. Probably not, and I think some of it is because of the life stage that we're in. We don't really know what it might be like for people who are just, deciding to have kids, having kids, what that experience is like. So we can't really represent that.
Okay. How has societal attitudes, including information about mis and disinformation towards marriage equality, impacted your relationship? And how have you navigated those attitudes? And this is a two-part question, but I will stop there first. Or I can give you the second half, which is, are there any forms of discrimination or prejudice you've experienced that you would like to share?
Well, I think as a caveat, I should say that, we started dating in 1982, which is a long time ago. And we decided in 1984 that we would want to commit to having a committed relationship with each other. And the symbolic ritual that we did is we purchased rings for each other in 85, and they're exactly alike, and we still wear them to this day. So, you can sort of hear through that story that we really created and crafted our own way through, and frankly, never really considered that we would ever be legally married. That was just not on the map. It was not something we thought about. We were very accustomed to being, outside of, what I guess at that time we would call mainstream society. And so we just went forward, making our own way. fast forward to 2015, when it narrowly passed, we were happily shocked and decided that a friend of ours who's a Quaker minister, we'd ask her if she would marry us. And she said, of course. And her Quaker minister was our photographer. We went to a very treasured site here in Oxford, which is the commemoration of Freedom Summer in the early 1960s. And, you know, that site really commemorates so many people who worked so hard for equality issues, voting rights, and some lost their lives that summer. So it just felt quite apt to, you know, we're standing on their shoulders in some respects, to go there and be a part of those souls that did such hard work for so many. So we were married there. There were 4 of us that were there. And then we went out for, you know, a little dinner uptown. So that's kind of what happened. So while your questions are good ones, we don't really, ours is a context where, you know, we've been out for so many years and have had to do so many different workarounds in different situations that we're just accustomed to that.
Yeah, let me just emphasize the idea that we never thought about getting married. Wasn't something we were hot to do. We did think about having a long-term relationship. And it's also true that we tried to cement in a civil way. And as a consequence of many privileges we had financially and educationally, we tried to cement as many rights as we could in a civil context. So partnership agreements and wills and powers of attorney of various kinds, plans for dissolution of joint ownership. And, you know, we tried to put in place everything we could. And friends of ours also did the same thing. And in the cases where they had children between them, they also went for civil remedies for what would be discrimination and what would maybe come with marriage. But you could not make up the 1,000+ marriage privileges that come with marriage, with legal marriage. So you went for the ones we did. We went for the ones that were more as protective as we could get. That would be the word we would use. A desire to protect the integrity of our relationship.
Thank you both. Might I ask if I'm going to go away from the course of the questions I sent you a little bit and just ask you a follow-up question. I'm also a lesbian. I've been out since 2005, and I remember, so a lot of major wins happened, you know, during the course of my lifetime, and for me, I noticed a visible shift in the culture, and so I can imagine that is incredibly more profound from your perspective. So I would be really interested to know how you perceive that shift in public perception, and what do you feel was the force in guiding it, and whether you think we're moving backwards on that shift in perception. And also, I'm curious to know how you felt when I remember where I was when marriage equality was announced. I was at a rally in Las Vegas at the LGBTQ Community Center. And I remember standing and doing the Pledge of Allegiance for the first time in 10 years. And it was like the first time that I really felt I was included in what was being said. And I will always remember that moment. So I'm wondering how that felt for you, having, had this experience where you were, really having to make your own way with this the government not recognizing your love and your relationship for so long, how that might have impacted you. So
I guess I was really touched by it. I really, having lived for so long, as Barb said, we just didn't even think. So the fact that there had been enough change really touched me. And it made me think a lot about how in the late 1980s, there was, or the early 1980s, I should say, there was a lot of talk within the LGBTQ community, wasn't Q yet, where we were talking about the importance of coming out, and that by coming out, we would be more visible to others. And as we were more visible to others, they would learn more about the ways in which, probably as people, we have things in common and things that are different. But that, it would sort of start to break down stereotypes. And a lot of us in, the community that we lived in and then going forward really endorsed that and began doing it. And I really think that that decision in part rested on all of that work that was done for so many years on the parts of so many people to have the courage to come out one by one, by one, by one, by one. And so that's why it really touched me, because I realized that that one by one movement really made a difference, because people broke down stereotypes. They stopped fearing us, although that's still the case as well, because we're just so scary. But it was touching. It was really touching. And the kind of ceremony that we had was very private and very personal, and had a historical root that we really respected deeply. So it was nice.
I think a change, I think that what the legalization, the federal legalization did was it made a number of other roadblocks fall away, not roadblocks to marriage equality necessarily, but both of us either lost or very nearly lost our jobs were before this. And I can remember that once it became, once marriage equality became legal and public, this is important, and public, and was enfranchised in a kind of way in the law, maybe not in the way we would all desire, but it was enfranchised in the law. The result, I felt, was a falling away of a lot of that, I'm going to fire you, even though you're a private institution and can fire these people. Whoa, it was a lot harder. It was a lot harder to sort of not just suggest that your thoughts about human rights were despicable, but that you'd be seen as against the laws of the country. And so I think that marriage equality was offered an entrance into a pulling back from more repressive individual and cultural circumstances. So I saw that and I liked it. I mean, I got a t-shirt and everything. I liked it that we could just say, oh yeah, we got married. But to this day, I can't say my wife or even my spouse. I still say my partner because it more adequately reflects my feelings about all of this. And what we didn't say yet, but could, is that we were urged to marry by our heterosexual, as far as we know, financial advisor, who said, "Oh, you could do way better on this. You should get married." So
And he was right,
he was right.
which was a lovely little perk.
But we had that privilege. And like I say, it
Right.
was the privilege of knowing how to work a system that had always protected us in some way. So this was a new system that we were learning how to work.
No, thank you both so much for sharing that. I think, you know, I think maybe the first question was a bit too limited because, like you said, that marriage opened all of these doors to other legal protections like equality in the workplace through just kind of the visibility and normalization of you know, being gay, and that's not a scary thing, as you said. So I think that's a really important connection. Okay, so last question, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Mira. Have you found any support networks or resources to be advocates and community members that show up and out for marriage equality? Maybe any groups that you would like to share with our audience if they'd like to become more involved? Maybe OCPJ.
Yeah, OCPJ, for sure, Oxford Citizens for Peace and Justice. And also our local PFLAG organization is good. They're active and have been active for many years, actually. And so that's really a good resource to turn to for support and for activism. So I think that's important. I think, as is the case for any of us who are in a I don't like this word anymore, but quote, minority class, that it is important to network. It is important to connect with one another and to find allies and to be in the midst of people who can support your life. Because obviously there have been many things that have happened over all these years, including I'm the person who lost her job. And, you know, that would be a little bit harder, like Barb said, I think, for it to happen today than it happened to me. And that was in the early 80s.
And I think that there's not exactly organized groups for marriage equality, but I find Old Lesbians Organizing for Change to be a group that offers lots of sustenance and community. And I think things like literary circles and Sinister Wisdom and groups like that, because I was an English teacher, right, and also a lesbian who found community when there was none in written resources. I still find these things to be enormously important, and that they are the things, say, what's the name of that group? Split it, no. Anyway, a group of poetry folk that I find very important. And these things, I think, offered sustenance more than political activity necessarily. These days, I think one can count on large organizations, political organizations, for two things that are important. One is financial resources for individuals or couples or whomever who find themselves without resources to fight this stuff. And so therefore an organizing capacity to, I mean, GoFundMe's nice, but it's not the only way to raise sources. And then also the kind of push for a public visibility and keeping it public has been a sustaining factor.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your story and being vulnerable with us. We really appreciate the discussion. And
can I tag in here with one really quick story? Now that I know that we're all from the Oxford area, the question was there any stories to share about discrimination? And so a couple of years ago, I was coming back from the farmer's market and I was walking down one of the alleys in town. And I struck up a conversation with a guy who was at that point sitting in his truck. And so he and I just started chatting in the alleyway. And I don't know, we just hit it off. I don't really know why. Sometimes you just meet somebody and you know that you just kind of hit it off with them. So we're chatting back and forth and talking about his job, which involved the alleys, and it involved a lot of hard work around the trash. And there was a couple who I would assume are same sex. They looked like two female women walking by, and they were holding hands. So turned to me, and he said, "Now that I have a real problem with that. I don't care for that at all." And I looked at him, and I think that what happened is he saw a flicker of something in my face. And he said, "Oh dear, I've offended you." And I said, "Well, you know, Richard, sometimes you just don't know who you're speaking with." "Oh no, I didn't mean to. I did. Oh gosh, I feel so bad." And I said, "Okay, that's okay. We all live and learn. It's all right. I've really enjoyed talking with you." And he kept going on about how bad he felt, right? And I think we left on a good note, but it also taught me that you just never know when it is important to come out to somebody until you try. And I think that gave me a lesson in continuing to try, but I think he learned something walking away too.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yeah, no, I think that's very important. I've encountered many comments like that and have responded by coming out, and I really do think it makes a difference.
Mhm.
It's very easy to dehumanize someone you can't put a face on, right? So I think that's a good place for us to move into our wrap up. Mira, so I'm gonna turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so I know it's 5 and we said we weren't gonna go past 5. But if all of you can stay on for just a few more minutes, I think actually, if Tyler, you don't mind, I'm gonna just turn it over to you because you are the faith director at the task force to just give your very insightful perspective on faith in our limited time we have.
Sure, no problem, Mira. Hi, everyone. Thank you once again for joining in. My name is Tahil Sharma. My pronouns are he and they, and I'm the faith director at the National LGBTQ Task Force. What's really important to think about in the context of all of this is the role that, faith communities have been playing and can play going forward. We can't deny the pretty active role of religious nationalism in the context of Christianity that's playing out through projects like Project 2025, through the role of its use in the administration, through some of the even historical precedent of how we have understood the jurisprudence of Christianity in the context of American law. So what we have to be really clear about is the efforts that we need to take to make sure we're pushing back against this administration, against administrations that we see at the state and local level, is to remember that we are pushing back against the fringe, against extremism, against nationalism, and against the violence that can be associated with that in so many ways, with the use of pluralism. We have to remember that our dynamic engagement across religious, spiritual, secular, indigenous backgrounds plays actually a very big role in being able to push back against laws that are being passed, against extrajudicial violence, and to be able to advocate for underrepresented communities. Marriage equality still has a long fight ahead of it. Not just for those who may identify as cisgender and homosexual, but for transgender community members who also, fall into this. And for the idea that accessibility to marriage can be a challenge in so many different ways across different traditions, across different communities. So if we're going to be pushing for that and for the rights overall of LGBTQ plus people, we have to remember that our work together is crucial. And there are a couple of examples that you see on the screen right now, where there are particular cases where faith communities are playing positive roles through coalition in being able to push back some of this work. Currently, there was a decision that was passed down by a circuit court that confirmed that ICE was able to enter sacred spaces. That fight continues to go on. But it was started by a major coalition of faith communities that actually was pushing back against ICE, saying that their entrance into certain spaces was illegal. In the Mahmoud versus Taylor case, we are noticing that the conversations about religious freedom are for being able to ban books and language and curricula and against banning books, agendas, and curricula. So we have to be really mindful that religion only plays the role that you want it to when it comes to this kind of work that's happening at the local, state, and federal level. And thinking about the recent vote by the Southern Baptist Convention to mobilize to overturn marriage equality, it is one of many denominations that may be in consensus about that idea. Just as there is a consensus across denominations that are Christian and faith communities that look towards marriage equality and say that there needs to be inclusive language that includes LGBTQ people. So you have to think about the ways that you want to get involved in that work, whether it is speaking directly to your elected representatives, writing to them, calling them, showing up at their offices, being able to lean into some organizations that are doing some of this mobilization work. We at the National LGBTQ Task Force are trying to come up with resources to be able to help you think about how you approach policy and organizing. There are larger organizations focused on the interfaith approach to this work, like Interfaith Alliance, that have a lot of resources that could help you as well. And just remember that the role of faith always depends on the people in the pews, not just the people at the pulpits. And faith will only show up in its best form when it leaves a sacred space and shows up in the public square. I'll pass it back.
Thank you so much. Tahil said it better than I could, so thank you for that. That concludes the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Geneva can probably give my email out after the presentation if you have any other questions following the webinar. But thank you so much. Thank you so much to Susan and Barb. Your story was great. Thank you for being so vulnerable and putting a real life experience to the things that we are talking about. And I'll pass it over to Geneva.
Thank you, Mira. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but I want to open it up before we log off. If anyone has a question that they would like to ask, please feel free to do so now. Okay, there is one question in the chat. Is there a bridge effort with more moderate religious organizations? Some might like nation states, but also might be for marriage equality. I don't know if Tahil or Mira would be better to answer that, but
Yeah, that's a good question. Is there a bridge effort from moderate religious organizations? Well, it does exist, I think, more in the realm of civic dialogue and engagement, and I don't think it evolves itself to a level of engaging in legal political processes. Because there is a desire and a need to be able to engage with communities that kind of sit on the fence or are neutral in a lot of these issue bases. I would say that Geneva and I have come across a great number of communities and organizations that like to take the middle road, or as we like to call the apathetic road, of just saying that people should be coming together to keep the peace. And what ends up happening, unfortunately, is that it becomes a disqualifier for the issue to even come up. We know that some issues are trying to go a little deeper into the complexity of issues like marriage equality, and speaking about the rights of LGBTQ people, and they are trying to create space for those dialogues to happen. Interfaith America has dabbled into that. That is a national organization that is based in Chicago, that's been trying to focus back and forth on some of this work around being able to include LGBTQ people in interfaith spaces. But this is more of the work of local interfaith councils and communities that do need to talk about this, because the moderate religious organizations kind of sit at the local and state-based levels. So being able to reach out to your own interfaith coalitions with them directly is going to have more impact than looking at it from the national level. And all of those collective efforts can then be pushed towards national agendas and platforms, because that seems to be able to get more people involved and invested in the work.
Thank you, Tahil. I think we have a couple more questions coming in the chat. Can you say more about what benefits covenant marriage would have over regular marriage?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a covenant marriage is a little bit more of an intense marriage, if that's a good way to put it. So they are designed to create a very strong, lifelong, permanent commitment, which of course, why wouldn't all marriage be like that? But they a covenant marriage requires intensive premarital counseling, and emphasizes like seeking couples counseling, like basically doing everything you can to not get a divorce. So that's kind of a little bit of a different viewpoint than a traditional marriage. So it's limited divorce grounds. So they really like kind of enforce you to do as much as you can before getting a divorce. And it's said that covenant marriages are associated with like lower divorce rates. And they come with tax benefits like traditional marriages. I don't know the weeds of other types of benefits, but that's really the main conceptual difference between the two. And then, yeah, and I can answer the next question. So,
okay, go for it.
Is there any effort ongoing in Ohio to put same-sex marriage on the ballot as a constitutional amendment? Yes. I think they are trying to introduce a measure to place the constitutional amendment on the ballot in 2026, but it was introduced by a couple of Democratic representatives in their state house. I think it's the Marriage Equality Act. I don't think that it has moved anywhere, but I can double check that. Ohio is definitely one of those states who is trying to do the same thing.
Are there any final questions? I don't see any more in the chat right now, but I just want to open up to the floor. If anyone, you can also unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one. Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing any other questions. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to Mira and Tahil and the LGBTQ Task Force for facilitating this conversation. Thank you to Susan and Barb for providing your testimonial. And thank you to all of you for being here and participating and asking questions. We're very grateful that you're here and you care about these issues. And we are hoping this will be the first in a series of discussions around similar topics related to LGBTQ rights in light of the new administration. So please stay tuned to our newsletter and website for things for announcements for subsequent programming. So does anyone have any final last words, Mira or Tahil or Susan or Barb? Okay, great. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.